Monica Davis stepped into the humming chaos of the airport terminal, her heels clicking sharply against the polished floor, her every movement straight-backed. Deliberate, suggested a woman accustomed to navigating spaces where she was often the only one of her kind. Her tailored navy suit, crisp white blouse, and leather carry-on projected competence and poise. She had spent years building this armor. And today, it felt heavier than usual. She approached Gate 27, her first-class boarding pass in hand. Around her, passengers rushed, families reunited, and announcements melded into a steady hum. Yet beneath the din, Monica felt a current, subtle but unmistakable, of people appraising her. It was in the way a young couple's eyes flicked over her before turning away, or the faint arch of the gate agent's brow when their gazes met. The woman at the counter, Evelyn Harper, didn't smile as Monica approached. Her name tag gleamed in the fluorescent light, but her demeanor was anything but welcoming. Evelyn's sharp eyes scanned Monica, lingering in a way that felt invasive. Monica offered a polite smile. "Good afternoon," she said, presenting her boarding pass. Evelyn barely glanced at it before her lips tightened. "This doesn't look right," she said, holding up the pass as if it were counterfeit. Her voice carried just enough volume to attract the attention of nearby passengers. Monica straightened, her grip tightening on her carry-on. "It's valid. If you check the system, you'll see my reservation." Evelyn didn't budge. "We get a lot of these," she said, her tone heavy with implication. People trying to sneak into first class when they don't belong. There it was, subtle but cutting. A statement loaded with years of unspoken judgment. Monica could feel the eyes of the other passengers now. Some curious, others openly skeptical. The air grew thicker as Evelyn's words lingered. Monica's voice was calm but firm. "I paid for this ticket. If there's an issue, I suggest you resolve it professionally." Evelyn smirked. "I'll need to call security to verify," she said, already reaching for the phone. The moment felt surreal. Monica had prepared for countless challenges in her career as a corporate attorney, hostile boardrooms, grueling negotiations, but this public insinuation of her unworthiness struck deeper than she expected. Passengers in the line shifted uncomfortably, their whispers growing louder. A middle-aged man in a rumpled suit shook his head, muttering something under his breath. A young woman openly stared, her expression teetering between pity and intrigue. Monica remained rooted, her composure a shield against the quiet storm brewing around her. Two security officers arrived, led by a man whose badge read Officer Tyler. His gaze flicked between Monica and Evelyn, the latter eager to explain. "This passenger presented a first-class ticket that looks fraudulent," Evelyn said, her tone dripping with exaggerated professionalism. Monica stepped forward, handing over her driver's license and the receipt for her ticket. Her movements were precise, deliberate. "Here's my identification and proof of purchase," she said, her voice steady despite the indignation simmering beneath. Tyler studied the documents before looking back at Evelyn. "Everything checks out," he said, his voice hesitant, as if reluctant to challenge her authority. Evelyn's face hardened. "Well, it's still suspicious," she insisted. "I mean, how often do we see someone like—" She stopped short. But the implication was clear. The words hit Monica like a slap. She had heard them in various forms all her life, veiled in politeness or cloaked in bureaucratic language. They weren't meant to wound outright but to remind her, always, that she was out of place. Monica turned to Tyler. "If my documents are in order, I'd like to proceed." Evelyn interrupted, her tone smug. "I'm calling the manager. I don't think we're done here." Monica exhaled slowly, willing herself to remain calm. This wasn't just about her ticket anymore, it was about principle. "Fine," she said, "but I expect this to be handled appropriately." She stepped aside, her posture unwavering even as passengers continued to board, their judgment evident in their averted eyes and whispered commentary. She noticed a white man breeze through with his ticket barely glanced at. The disparity so blatant it almost made her laugh. Inside, Monica's indignation burned hotter, but she stayed quiet. Years of navigating rooms filled with unspoken biases had taught her the value of measured responses. Her silence now was not submission, it was strategy. When the gate manager, James Benson, finally arrived, Monica straightened her shoulders and met his gaze directly. She didn't flinch, didn't falter. As Evelyn explained her version of events, Monica waited, her calm exterior masking the storm brewing beneath. Benson turned to her. "Miss Davis, I apologize for the inconvenience. Officer Tyler has confirmed your documents are valid. You're free to board." But Monica didn't move. Her voice, when she spoke, was deliberate, cutting through the tension like a scalpel. "Before I board, I'd like to address something. This isn't just an inconvenience, it's a reflection of a deeper problem." The terminal grew quiet, her words hanging in the air. Monica turned to Evelyn, her gaze unwavering. "You accused me of fraud without evidence. You dismissed my documentation, and you implied quite clearly that I don't belong in first class. Is that correct?" Evelyn faltered, her earlier bravado wilting under Monica's unrelenting stare. "This isn't just about me," Monica continued, her voice steady but powerful. "It's about the assumptions you've made and the policies this airline has failed to enforce." Benson, visibly uncomfortable, stepped in. "Miss Davis, we'll address this matter thoroughly. I assure you." Monica handed him her business card, her name and title embossed in bold letters. "See that you do," she said, her tone leaving no room for doubt. As she finally boarded the plane, the weight of the stairs didn't bother her. Monica had faced battles like this before, and she knew she would face them again. But today, she had drawn a line. And for now, that was enough. Monica settled into her first-class seat, her leather carry-on tucked carefully under the seat in front of her. The cabin buzzed with subdued activity, flight attendants storing luggage, passengers adjusting their seats. But beneath the veneer of civility, Monica felt the tension rippling around her. She didn't need to look up to know the whispers continued. The man across the aisle, the same one who had watched her earlier, glanced her way again, his expression caught somewhere between curiosity and discomfort. The flight attendant approached, her polished smile faltering for a fraction of a second before recovering. "Good afternoon, Miss Davis. Would you like something to drink before takeoff?" Monica met her gaze evenly. "Water, thank you." The interaction seemed routine, but Monica caught the flicker of something in the woman's eyes, hesitation. Maybe even suspicion. It was subtle, the kind of thing you couldn't call out without being accused of reading too much into it. But Monica had spent her life reading too much into it because it was always there. She accepted the glass of water with a polite nod and turned her focus to the tablet in her lap. She had planned to spend the flight preparing for her meeting, but the confrontation at the gate clung to her like a stubborn shadow. She opened the airline's employee code of conduct, scrolling through the sections on passenger treatment and anti-discrimination policies. The words on the page felt hollow, their intent undermined by the reality she had just experienced. As the plane taxied to the runway, Monica's mind drifted. The incident with Evelyn Harper wasn't unique, it was part of a pattern she knew all too well. It wasn't just about race, though that was always the undertone. It was about power, who had it, who wielded it, and who was constantly made to prove they deserved even a fraction of it. The hum of the engines grew louder, signaling takeoff, and Monica closed her eyes, letting the rhythmic vibrations steady her thoughts. But peace was fleeting. A voice, low but insistent, broke through her reverie. "Excuse me," said the man across the aisle. His tone was hesitant, almost apologetic. Monica opened her eyes and turned to face him. His suit was rumpled, his tie slightly askew, but his expression carried a mix of earnestness and unease. "I couldn't help but notice what happened back there," he began. "That was something." Monica arched a brow, unsure where this was going. "Yes," she said simply. "I mean," he continued, stumbling over his words, "I just can't believe they treated you like that. It's unbelievable." Monica studied him for a moment. He seemed well-meaning, but there was a tone in his voice she recognized, an eagerness to distance himself from the problem, to prove he wasn't like them. She had encountered it before, a performance of solidarity that rarely went beyond words. "Unfortunately," she replied, her tone measured, "it's not that unbelievable. Things like this happen more often than you might think." He nodded, his face darkening with what she assumed was indignation on her behalf. "Still," he said, leaning in slightly, "you handled it with a lot of grace. I don't know if I could have kept my cool." Monica allowed herself a small smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. "Grace," she repeated softly. "That's what they call it when you don't react in a way that makes them uncomfortable." The man blinked, caught off guard by her candor. "I didn't mean." "I know," Monica said, cutting him off gently but firmly. "But that's the reality, isn't it? You can't push back too hard, or you become the problem. So, you learn to swallow the indignities, to choose your battles, and when you do speak up, you make sure it's in a way that won't scare them. The man sat back, visibly uncomfortable now. He opened his mouth as if to respond but seemed to think better of it. Monica turned her attention back to her tablet, signaling the conversation was over. The flight settled into a quiet rhythm, the murmur of passengers blending with the soft hum of the engines. But Monica's thoughts refused to settle. She thought about Evelyn, about the subtle ways power and prejudice intersected in spaces like this. It wasn't always overt, more often. It was in the glances, the assumptions, the small ways people signaled that you didn't belong. It reminded her of her early days in the corporate world, where she was often the only black woman in the room. The comments about how articulate she was. The surprise when she mentioned her Ivy League education. The questions about whether she had ever experienced real hardship. They were never meant to offend, of course. They were framed as curiosity. Even compliments. But Monica knew better. They were reminders, tiny, barbed reminders that she was being allowed into a space, not welcomed. The flight attendant returned with a tray of refreshments, and Monica noticed how her demeanor shifted depending on who she was serving. For the white couple in the row ahead, there was warmth, familiarity. For the elderly black man across the aisle, there was efficiency, but little else. Monica watched as the man hesitated before asking for coffee. His voice quiet, almost apologetic, as if bracing for rejection. The flight attendant didn't refuse him, but the interaction was perfunctory. The kind of service you gave when you were doing the bare minimum. Monica's chest tightened, a familiar pang of anger and sadness welling up. It was these moments, the ones that seemed too small to matter, that cut the deepest. Because they weren't small, they were cumulative, each one a drop in a bucket that threatened to overflow. By the time the plane reached cruising altitude, Monica's resolve had hardened. The incident at the gate wasn't just an isolated affront, it was a symptom of something larger. Something that needed to be confronted. And if there was one thing Monica Davis didn't shy away from, it was a fight. She opened a blank document on her tablet, her fingers moving swiftly over the keyboard. She wasn't just drafting a report, she was preparing for battle. Her weapon would be precision facts, policies, the kind of airtight arguments that couldn't be ignored. Evelyn Harper had underestimated her, and so had the system that enabled her. But Monica had no intention of letting them win. The plane hit a pocket of turbulence, jolting Monica from her thoughts. She looked around the cabin, her gaze lingering on the faces of her fellow passengers. Most were oblivious, engrossed in their books or screens. But Monica couldn't help wondering how many of them carried their own silent battles, their own unseen scars. As the plane steadied, Monica returned to her work, her determination unwavering. This wasn't just about her. It was about everyone who had ever been made to feel like they didn't belong. Who had ever been told, in ways both subtle and overt, that they were less than. And Monica Davis had no intention of staying silent. Not anymore. As the plane began its descent, Monica Davis felt the familiar ache behind her temples. It wasn't the altitude or the pressurized cabin, it was the weight of the unspoken truths that had followed her from the gate to her seat and lingered in the air around her for the entire flight. The kind of truths that didn't need words to cut deep. Their impact measured not in volume but in the silence they left behind. The flight attendant returned to Monica's row, her polite but distant demeanor still intact. "We'll be landing shortly, Miss Davis. If there's anything else you need before we arrive, please let me know." "No, thank you," Monica replied evenly, her voice measured as always. She could feel the flight attendant's hesitation, the unspoken question in her eyes. "Who are you to draw this much attention?" The attendant moved on, leaving Monica to her thoughts. Across the aisle, the elderly black man she'd noticed earlier sat with his hands folded tightly in his lap. His coffee cup remained untouched, its contents gone cold long before. Monica recognized the look on his face, the same mix of resignation and restraint she had learned to master. It was the face of someone who had seen too much, borne too much, and knew too well the futility of pushing back in certain moments. But Monica had pushed back. At the gate, in front of strangers, with no guarantee that her position or her words would carry weight. She had learned to choose her battles carefully. But there were moments when silence was its own betrayal. This had been one of those moments. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom. announcing their approach to the airport. Monica glanced out the window. The city lights coming into view below, sprawling and intricate like veins pulsing with life. She thought about the meeting that awaited her. The boardroom full of men and women who would expect her to be as polished and unyielding as she had always been. But for the first time in a long time, Monica felt something new, an unrelenting need to address what had happened, not just as an executive, but as a human being. The plane touched down with a jolt, and the usual scramble of activity followed. Passengers unbuckled their seatbelts, reached for their luggage, and shuffled toward the exit. Monica remained seated, her movements deliberate as she slid her tablet into her bag. She wanted to be the last to leave, to avoid the murmurs and stolen glances that always seemed louder in the confined space of a plane. When she finally stepped onto the jet bridge, the cool air was a welcome reprieve. The terminal was bustling, the noise of travelers blending into a chaotic symphony. Monica walked with purpose, her heels clicking against the polished floor, but her mind remained fixed on what had transpired at the gate. The confrontation had been a microcosm of a much larger issue, one she had spent her career fighting against but had never fully escaped. Her phone buzzed as she reached the arrivals area. A message from James Benson, the gate manager who had intervened earlier, appeared on her screen. "Miss Davis, I'd like to follow up with you personally regarding today's incident. Please let me know when you're available." Monica stared at the message for a moment, her thumb hovering over the keyboard. She appreciated the gesture, but she knew a polite follow-up wouldn't be enough. This wasn't about smoothing things over, it was about accountability. She typed a quick reply. "I'll be in touch soon. Expect a detailed report from me by the end of the week." As she exited the terminal, a driver waited by the curb holding a sign with her name. "Miss Davis?" he asked, opening the car door with practiced ease. "Yes," she replied, sliding into the backseat. The leather interior was cool against her skin, the faint scent of air freshener a welcome distraction from the tension that had followed her since the gate. The car pulled into traffic, and Monica retrieved her phone again, scrolling through emails from her office. She paused at one marked confidential, sent by an employee who had worked with Evelyn Harper. The subject line read, "Concerning the Gate 27 incident." Monica opened the email, her eyes scanning the contents. The message detailed other instances of Evelyn's behavior, passengers turned away without cause, co-workers reluctant to speak up for fear of retaliation. The words on the screen felt like confirmation of something Monica already knew. Evelyn's actions weren't isolated. Nor were they accidental. They were part of a pattern. A culture of quiet complicity that allowed bias to flourish under the guise of policy enforcement. Her fingers tightened around her phone as the car merged onto the highway. She thought about the layers of this issue. How it wasn't just about Evelyn but about the system that had enabled her. It was a system that thrived on the plausible deniability of small, unspoken acts, a raised eyebrow, a dismissive tone, a judgment passed without evidence. It was a system that had long demanded grace and patience from people like Monica while asking nothing of those who perpetuated it. By the time the car pulled up to her hotel, Monica's resolve had crystallized. She wasn't just going to draft a report, she was going to demand systemic change. The challenges ahead would be steep, she knew that. But Monica Davis had spent her entire life climbing, and she wasn't about to stop now. As she entered the sleek, modern lobby, the concierge greeted her with a warm smile. "Good evening, Miss Davis. Welcome back." Monica nodded politely, her mind already turning toward the work that awaited her upstairs. The elevator doors closed with a quiet chime, sealing her in with her thoughts. For Monica, the fight wasn't just about ensuring her own dignity, it was about dismantling the unspoken hierarchies that dictated who was seen, who was heard, and who was allowed to belong. The doors opened, and Monica stepped into the hallway, her heels sinking into the plush carpet. She reached her room, slid her keycard into the lock, and entered the quiet sanctuary. For a brief moment, she allowed herself to exhale, to let the weight of the day settle before she prepared for the battles yet to come. Monica knew this was just the beginning. The real challenge wasn't in confronting Evelyn Harper or drafting a report, it was in confronting the deeper, insidious truths about a system that had been designed to exclude, to divide, to diminish. And as Monica sat at the desk, her laptop glowing softly in the dim light, she knew one thing for certain: the road ahead would not be easy. But it would be necessary. Monica sat in the hotel's conference room the next morning, a steaming cup of coffee untouched before her. The room was sparse, its clean lines and modern decor a stark contrast to the messy reality she was about to confront. Across from her sat James Benson, the gate manager from the previous day. His demeanor was professional but cautious, his neatly pressed suit unable to hide the tension in his posture. "Miss Davis," he began, his tone tentative, "thank you for taking the time to meet with me. I want to start by apologizing again for what happened yesterday." Monica nodded, her expression neutral. "I appreciate the apology, Mr. Benson, but I'm not here for that. I'm here to discuss how this happened in the first place and how we're going to make sure it doesn't happen again." Benson's shoulders tightened slightly, but he nodded. "Of course, I've already started looking into Ms. Harper's behavior. I want to assure you that this incident is being taken very seriously." Monica leaned forward, her voice calm but edged with steel. "What I want, Mr. Benson, is more than assurances. I want accountability. What happened at Gate 27 wasn't just an isolated mistake, it was the result of a culture that allows bias to go unchecked. You may think this begins and ends with Ms. Harper, but it doesn't." Benson looked down at his notes, his discomfort palpable. "I understand your concerns," he said carefully, "but we do have policies in place." Monica cut him off, her tone sharpening. "Policies mean nothing if they're not enforced. And from what I've seen, they aren't. Do you know how many complaints have been filed against Ms. Harper?" Benson hesitated, and Monica's gaze bore into him. 7, she said, her voice firm. 7 complaints, spanning the last 3 years. And yet she's still here, still representing this company. How do you explain that?" He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It's not as simple as it seems. There's a lot of pressure to keep things running smoothly, especially at a hub this busy. Sometimes, things get overlooked." "Overlooked," Monica repeated, her tone bitter. "That's one way to put it. But what you're really saying is that efficiency takes precedence over fairness. That people like Ms. Harper are given a pass because dealing with them is inconvenient. And do you know who pays the price for that convenience? Mr. Benson?" He didn't answer, but the shame in his expression was answer enough. Monica leaned back, her voice softening but losing none of its intensity. "This isn't just about one gate agent. It's about a system that tolerates bias, that allows microaggressions to accumulate until they become impossible to ignore. And as someone who represents this company at the highest level, I can't and won't turn a blind eye to it." Benson nodded slowly, his resistance eroding under the weight of her words. "You're right," he admitted. "We've failed to address this. And I take responsibility for my part in that." Monica studied him for a moment, gauging his sincerity. "Responsibility is a good start," she said, "but it's not enough. I want to know exactly how you plan to address this, not just with Ms. Harper, but with the culture that allowed her behavior to persist." Benson nodded again, pulling out a folder. "We've initiated a review of all staff at this hub," he said, his voice steadier now. "We're also implementing additional training on bias and discrimination. And I've recommended that Ms. Harper be placed on administrative leave while the investigation is conducted." Monica's gaze didn't waver. "And what about accountability for those who failed to act on the complaints against her? Will there be consequences for that as well?" Benson hesitated, but he nodded. "Yes. We're going to review the handling of those complaints and address any failures appropriately." Monica nodded, her expression unreadable. "Good. Because this isn't just about protecting passengers, it's about protecting this company from the legal and reputational risks that come from ignoring these issues. I'm here to make sure that happens." The room fell silent for a moment, the gravity of her words settling over them. Finally, Benson spoke. "Thank you, Miss Davis. Your leadership is eye-opening. We've got a lot of work to do, but I'm committed to seeing it through." Monica inclined her head slightly, acknowledging his words without softening her stance. "I'll hold you to that, Mr. Benson." As the meeting concluded, Monica returned to her hotel room, her thoughts heavy with the weight of what lay ahead. The conversation with Benson was a small victory, but it was just the beginning. The real battle would be in addressing the systemic issues that ran far deeper than one gate agent or one airport. Later that afternoon, Monica opened her laptop and began drafting a memo to the executive team. Her fingers flew over the keyboard, each word a deliberate strike against the complacency she had encountered. She outlined the steps she expected the company to take: mandatory oversight of complaints, stricter enforcement of anti-discrimination policies, and a commitment to transparency at every level. As she typed, her mind drifted to the passengers she had seen during the flight: the elderly man with the untouched coffee, the flight attendant who had treated her with thinly veiled suspicion. These were the faces of a problem that stretched far beyond Atlantic air. A problem that existed in the quiet spaces where prejudice thrived in whispers and glances. When she finished the memo, Monica sat back and exhaled deeply. The challenges ahead felt insurmountable at times, but she knew they were worth facing. This wasn't just about her career or her reputation, it was about ensuring that no one else had to endure what she had. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the room in a warm, golden glow, Monica felt a sense of resolve settle over her. The road ahead would be long and fraught with resistance. But Monica Davis had never been one to back down from a fight. This was her moment to push for change, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been told, in ways both subtle and overt, that they didn't belong, and she intended to make it count. The Atlantic Air Regional Office was a gleaming tower of glass and steel, its reflective panels catching the late morning sun. Monica Davis stood outside, her leather briefcase in hand, her tailored suit immaculate as ever. She had faced boardrooms and courtrooms with the same unflinching resolve that carried her here today. But as she entered the building, she couldn't shake the unease that settled in her chest. This wasn't just a workplace, it was a battlefield, where the war against complacency and systemic inequity would be fought in quiet conversations and carefully worded memos. Inside, the air buzzed with restrained energy. Employees moved briskly through the halls, their clipped conversations punctuated by the tapping of keyboards and the occasional ring of a phone. Monica's heels echoed against the polished floors as she approached the conference room where the HR team and senior managers waited. The weight of their collective gaze would soon be upon her, and Monica braced herself for the resistance she knew was coming. When she entered, the room stilled. James Benson sat at one end of the long table, his posture stiff but his expression earnest. Beside him was Karen Yates, the HR director, her tightly bound bun and stack of neatly arranged papers signaling an unyielding professionalism. Around them were other managers, their faces a mixture of curiosity, skepticism, and quiet discomfort. "Good morning," Monica began, her voice steady but unyielding as she set her briefcase on the table. "Let's get started." Yates nodded, clearing her throat. "Miss Davis, thank you for joining us. As you know, we've initiated a review of the incident at Gate 27. We've already taken steps to address Ms. Harper's behavior. She's been placed on administrative leave and we're implementing additional training for all Gate staff." Monica listened, her expression inscrutable. "That's a start," she said, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "But training alone won't solve the problem. What we're dealing with here isn't just an individual failure, it's a systemic one. And systemic problems require systemic solutions." Yates shifted uncomfortably in her seat, glancing at Benson for support. "We've also begun reviewing past complaints against Ms. Harper and other employees," she said. "We're taking this very seriously." Monica's gaze hardened. "Are you? Because from where I'm sitting, it doesn't look that way. 7 complaints were filed against Ms. Harper over the past 3 years. And not one of them led to meaningful action. That's not just negligence, that's complicity." A murmur rippled through the room. And one of the managers, a man in his early 50s with graying hair and a defensive posture, spoke up. "Miss Davis, with all due respect, these things aren't always clear-cut. Sometimes complaints are exaggerated, or there's a misunderstanding." Monica cut him off, her voice cool but forceful. "A misunderstanding doesn't account for a pattern. This isn't about one bad day or one bad employee. This is about a culture that allows bias to thrive unchecked. Because it's easier to dismiss complaints than to address them. And let me be clear, that culture ends now." The man's face flushed, but he said nothing more. Monica turned her attention back to Yates. "What I want to know is this. How many other employees like Ms. Harper are out there? How many passengers have been subjected to discrimination because we failed to act?" Yates hesitated, flipping through her papers as if the answer might be buried there. "We're still gathering data," she said finally. "But I agree we need to do better." "Better isn't enough," Monica said sharply. "We need accountability. I've already outlined my recommendations, and I expect them to be implemented immediately." That includes mandatory oversight for all complaint dismissals, independent audits of our complaint handling processes, and a zero-tolerance policy for discriminatory behavior." The room fell silent, the weight of her words pressing down on everyone present. Monica scanned their faces, searching for signs of resistance or hesitation. Some nodded reluctantly, while others avoided her gaze entirely. "Accountability isn't just about punishing bad behavior," Monica continued, her voice softening but losing none of its conviction. "It's about creating a culture where everyone, passengers and employees alike, feels valued and respected. That's not just good ethics, it's good business. And if we don't act now, the consequences will be far greater than one PR scandal." Benson spoke up, his voice quieter but resolute. "Miss Davis is right. We've let this go on for too long. It's time to make real changes." Yates nodded reluctantly, and the other managers followed suit, their murmured agreements carrying a mix of resignation and resolve. Monica knew they weren't all convinced. But for now, it was enough. The first step was always the hardest, and she had pushed them to take it. After the meeting, Monica returned to her office, her mind racing with the challenges ahead. The resistance she had faced today was only the beginning. There would be more meetings, more arguments, more subtle attempts to undermine her efforts. But Monica had spent her entire life navigating spaces where she wasn't wanted. And she knew how to turn quiet defiance into unshakable resolve. As she sat at her desk, drafting a company-wide memo to announce the new measures, her phone buzzed with an email notification. It was from a junior employee who had attended one of the bias training sessions she had insisted on implementing. "Miss Davis," the email began, "I wanted to thank you for speaking out about what happened at Gate 27. I've worked here for 5 years, and I've seen things I didn't feel safe reporting. But seeing you stand up for what's right has given me hope. Please keep fighting. There are more of us behind you than you realize." Monica read the email twice, a faint smile breaking through her stern expression. She replied with a simple thank you. But the message stayed with her. The fight ahead would be long and difficult. But it was worth it. Not just for her, but for the people who believed in her, who needed her to succeed. That evening, as the city lights flickered outside her office window, Monica felt the weight of the day settle over her. The battles she fought weren't just about policies or procedures, they were about the quiet, insidious forces that shaped the world around her. But if there was one thing Monica Davis had learned, it was that change didn't come easily. It came through persistence, through courage, through refusing to back down when the odds were stacked against you. And Monica had no intention of backing down. The air in the boardroom was thick with tension, though none of the assembled executives dared to acknowledge it. The long mahogany table gleamed under the fluorescent lights, and the walls, adorned with bland corporate art, seemed to close in as Monica Davis stood at the head of the room. Her calm exterior betrayed none of the fire roiling within her, though her presence alone was enough to unsettle even the most composed among them. "Thank you for gathering on such short notice," Monica began, her voice smooth but firm. She looked each person in the eye, forcing them to meet her gaze, to reckon with the gravity of what she was about to say. "The findings of the internal review are clear and damning. What happened at Gate 27 was not an isolated incident. And it's time we faced the truth. This company has a culture problem." The murmurs started almost immediately, low and defensive, a chorus of discomfort and disbelief. Monica raised a hand, silencing the room. "This isn't a debate," she continued, her tone unyielding. "It's a fact. Over the past 3 years, complaints of discriminatory behavior at our major hubs have been dismissed or ignored at a rate significantly higher than at smaller regional airports. Our policies are being applied inconsistently. And that inconsistency has allowed people like Evelyn Harper to thrive." One of the executives, a man with graying hair and a reputation for being dismissive of social issues, leaned forward. "Miss Davis, while I don't deny there may have been lapses, don't you think it's a bit extreme to call this a culture problem? We're a business, not a social justice organization." Monica's gaze sharpened, her voice slicing through the air like a blade. "And do you think our passengers see the difference when they're being humiliated at the gate? Do you think it matters to them whether this is a business problem or a social one? It's both, and if we don't address it, it will destroy not just our reputation but our bottom line." The man leaned back, chastened but not convinced. Monica knew his type: men who believed in incremental change, if they believed in it at all. Men who were more concerned with keeping shareholders happy than confronting uncomfortable truths. "Let me be clear," she said, addressing the room. "This isn't about punishing a few bad apples. It's about dismantling a system that enables them. And that means looking at ourselves, at our own biases, our own complicity." Another voice spoke up, softer but no less resistant. "Miss Davis, we've already committed to new training sessions and stricter oversight. Isn't that enough for now?" "No," Monica replied, her tone unwavering, "because training and oversight won't mean anything if the people in this room aren't willing to lead by example. This starts with us, with the decisions we make, the standards we set, and the accountability we enforce. If we don't take this seriously, how can we expect anyone else to?" The room fell silent, the weight of her words settling over them like a heavy fog. Monica allowed the silence to linger, using it to emphasize the gravity of the moment. Finally, she turned to James Benson, who sat near the middle of the table, his usual confidence replaced by a quiet determination. "Mr. Benson," she said, "you've been at the center of this issue. What steps are you taking to ensure this doesn't happen again under your watch?" Benson straightened, clearing his throat. "We've already begun implementing the measures you recommended, Miss Davis. All complaints are now subject to review by an independent accountability committee. And we've started rolling out comprehensive training on implicit bias and equitable treatment. Additionally, I've committed to conducting regular audits of employee performance and complaint handling." Monica nodded. "Good, but it's not enough to put policies in place. We need to make sure those policies are enforced consistently. And that starts with transparency." She turned to the rest of the room. "I'm proposing a quarterly report on the state of our culture, an honest, unflinching look at where we're succeeding and where we're failing. That report will be shared with every employee, from the executives to the gate agents. If we're serious about change, we need to hold ourselves accountable, not just privately, but publicly." The murmurs began again, louder this time, tinged with resistance. One executive, a woman with a sharp suit and an even sharper tone, leaned forward. "That's a bold proposal, Miss Davis, but don't you think it could expose us to unnecessary scrutiny? The media could twist this into a PR nightmare." Monica's lips curved into a faint smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. "With all due respect, the PR nightmare has already happened. What we're doing now is damage control and laying the foundation for something better. If you're more concerned with appearances than with substance, then perhaps you're part of the problem." The woman recoiled slightly, her defiance faltering under Monica's unwavering gaze. Monica knew she was pushing hard, but she also knew that change didn't come from playing it safe. It came from confronting the truth, no matter how uncomfortable it might be. As the meeting continued, the resistance began to soften. One by one, the executives voiced their support for Monica's proposals, though some did so reluctantly. By the end of the discussion, the room felt lighter, as if a weight had been lifted, not the weight of the problem itself, but the weight of pretending it didn't exist. When the meeting adjourned, Monica lingered in the room, gathering her notes. Benson approached her, his expression thoughtful. "You know," he said, "I wasn't sure about you when this all started. But today, you made me realize something. Change doesn't happen because it's convenient. It happens because someone forces it to." Monica looked at him, her expression softening slightly. "Change happens because people are willing to fight for it," she said, "and because they refuse to give up, no matter how hard it gets." Benson nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Well, for what it's worth, I'm glad you're here to lead that fight." Monica watched him leave, a flicker of hope sparking in her chest. The road ahead would still be long and fraught with challenges. But for the first time, she felt like she wasn't walking it alone. As she stepped out of the boardroom and into the bustling office, Monica felt a renewed sense of purpose. The fight against prejudice and complacency wasn't just about policies or training sessions, it was about people. About hearts and minds. About the quiet moments where the lines between right and wrong became blurred. And if she had to redraw those lines herself, she would, because Monica Davis wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong, and for a world where those words would never be spoken again. Monica Davis arrived at the Atlantic Air Training Facility to oversee the first round of implicit bias workshops. The facility, all glass and steel, sat on the outskirts of the city, a sterile monument to corporate ambition. Inside, The air was filled with a quiet tension as employees, from gate agents to mid-level managers, shuffled into the training room, their expressions a mix of curiosity, skepticism, and thinly veiled resentment. Monica stood near the back, observing as the facilitator began the session. The room was brightly lit, the kind of lighting that left little room for shadows, literal or figurative. The facilitator, a young black woman with a calm but commanding presence, introduced herself and began to outline the goals of the workshop: fostering awareness, identifying biases, and creating a more inclusive workplace. For Monica, the goals were noble but abstract. What she needed was change that could be measured in actions, not just intentions. As the session progressed, Monica noticed the subtleties of resistance. A middle-aged man in a rumpled polo shirt leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, his expression blank but dismissive. A younger woman, her posture stiff with defensiveness, repeatedly glanced at her watch. Others nodded politely, their faces neutral, their engagement shallow. Monica knew these cues too well. They weren't just signs of discomfort, they were shields against accountability. The facilitator paused, inviting the group to share examples of biases they'd witnessed or experienced in the workplace. For a moment, silence hung heavy in the air. Then, a man near the front spoke up, his voice tinged with hesitation. "I guess I've seen people jump to conclusions about passengers," he said, avoiding eye contact. "But it's usually just because we're in a hurry. Not because of, bias." The facilitator nodded, her tone gentle but firm. "Thank you for sharing. Let's unpack that. Why do you think those conclusions are made? And how might they be influenced by assumptions about race, gender, or socioeconomic status?" The man shifted uncomfortably but didn't answer. His silence spoke volumes. From the back of the room, Monica's voice cut through the tension. "We tell ourselves that efficiency justifies our actions. But let's be honest, efficiency is often just an excuse. An excuse not to examine our biases. Not to take the time to treat people as individuals." All eyes turned to her, some wide with surprise, others narrowing in quiet defiance. Monica stepped forward, her heels clicking against the polished floor. "I've spent my entire career in rooms like this," she continued, her voice steady but charged. "And I've learned that silence is complicity. We like to think of bias as something other people have, something that happens somewhere else. But it happens here, in this room, every day. And if we don't confront it, we become part of the problem." Her words landed heavily, the room sinking into an uneasy quiet. The facilitator, sensing the tension, thanked Monica and encouraged the group to reflect. Monica returned to her seat, her heart pounding. She wasn't used to addressing resistance so directly in a setting like this. But she also knew the stakes were too high to stay silent. Blank. Blank. The day's challenges didn't end with the workshop. Later that afternoon, Monica met with Karen Yates, the HR director, to discuss the implementation of her proposed changes. Yates sat behind her desk, her hands clasped tightly, her polite smile masking a clear unease. "Miss Davis," Yates began, her tone measured, "I appreciate everything you've done to address these issues. But I have to be honest, there's been some pushback from leadership. Some feel that the changes you're proposing are excessive." Monica arched a brow. "Excessive?" she repeated. "Which part? The oversight? The accountability? Or the expectation that employees treat passengers with basic dignity?" Yates flushed but didn't falter. "It's not that they disagree with the goals," she said carefully. "It's the pace. They're worried about alienating employees or creating a perception that the company is overly focused on these issues at the expense of other priorities." Monica leaned forward, her voice lowering but gaining intensity. "Karen, let me ask you something. How many passengers have to endure what I did before this becomes a priority? How many complaints have to go ignored before we decide the pace is fast enough?" Yates hesitated, her silence answering Monica's question. "This isn't about perception," Monica continued. "It's about integrity. And if the leadership team is more concerned with how they'll look than with doing what's right, then we have a much bigger problem than I thought." Yates nodded slowly, her expression softening. "I understand. I do. But I need you to understand change doesn't come easy for some people." Monica's lips tightened into a faint, humorless smile. "Change doesn't come easy for anyone, Karen. But that doesn't mean we stop pushing. Blank. As Monica left the meeting, her phone buzzed with a message from James Benson. "Can we meet? Something's come up." She replied with a quick "on my way" and headed to his office. When she arrived, Benson looked uncharacteristically uneasy. He gestured for her to sit, his fingers tapping restlessly on his desk. "We've got a problem," he said without preamble. "There's been a backlash among some of the senior staff. They're claiming the new policies are creating a hostile environment." Monica let out a sharp breath. Hostile for whom? The people who've spent years ignoring complaints? Or the ones who've been the subject of those complaints? Benson grimaced. "You know how this works. Some people don't like being told they need to change. They're pushing back harder than I expected." Monica's jaw tightened, but her voice remained steady. "Let them push. They don't have to like it, they just have to comply." Benson hesitated, then nodded. "You're right, but I thought you should know it's going to get worse before it gets better." Monica stood, her posture as unyielding as her resolve. "I didn't expect this to be easy, James, and I'm not here to make people comfortable. I'm here to make things right." As she walked out of his office, the weight of the day pressed heavily on her shoulders. The resistance she faced wasn't just about policies or procedures, it was about people clinging to a world where they didn't have to question their assumptions or confront their biases. And Monica knew that dismantling that world would take more than workshops or memos. It would take a relentless, unflinching fight. But Monica Davis had never been one to back down. And she wasn't about to start now. Monica Davis sat in her office, the dim glow of the city skyline outside her window casting long shadows across the room. Her desk was littered with reports, emails, and notes from countless meetings. Each document was a battle fought, every page a testament to the work she had poured into confronting the rot with an Atlantic air. But tonight, the weight of it all seemed almost unbearable. It wasn't the resistance that drained her, not the backlash from employees or the guarded glances from senior staff during meetings. Monica had expected that. What ate at her were the subtler forces. The quiet, insidious voices that whispered, "Slow down." Or worse, "You've done enough." She thought about the passengers who would never know her name but would feel the effects of her work. The elderly black man on her flight who had shrunk into himself under the weight of indifference. The young gate agent who had thanked her after a training session, her voice trembling with gratitude. These moments kept Monica moving forward, even as the challenges grew steeper. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. It was an email from Karen Yates, marked urgent. Monica opened it, her eyes scanning the text quickly. The subject: anonymous employee feedback on new policies. The message detailed complaints from some employees who claimed the new accountability measures were creating a culture of fear. Monica frowned, her fingers tightening around her phone. Fear of what? Fear of being held accountable? Fear of losing the unchecked power they had grown accustomed to wielding? She set the phone down and leaned back in her chair, closing her eyes. The exhaustion seeped into her bones. But Monica knew rest wasn't an option. Not yet. Blank. Blank. The next morning, Monica walked into an all-hands meeting with the executive team. The atmosphere was tense, the room buzzing with barely concealed discomfort. James Benson was there, along with Karen Yates and the other department heads. They avoided her gaze as she took her seat at the head of the table. "I've read the feedback," Monica began, her voice steady but sharp. "And I understand that some employees feel uneasy about the changes we're making. But let me be clear. Discomfort is not oppression. Accountability is not persecution." A few heads nodded reluctantly, while others remained still. Monica pressed on. For years, this company operated under the assumption that efficiency mattered more than equity. That profits mattered more than people. That ends now. If some employees feel uncomfortable because they can no longer act without consequence, that's a discomfort I'm willing to accept. Benson shifted in his seat, his expression unreadable. "Miss Davis," he began carefully, "I don't think anyone disagrees with the goals you've outlined. But there's concern about alienating longtime employees, some of whom feel unfairly targeted." Monica's gaze locked onto his, unflinching. "James, this isn't about targeting individuals. It's about creating a culture where everyone is held to the same standard. If certain employees feel targeted, perhaps they should examine why." The silence that followed was heavy. But Monica didn't let it linger. "Change is hard," she continued, her voice softening slightly. "It forces us to confront parts of ourselves we'd rather ignore. But if we're serious about becoming the company we claim to be, then we can't shy away from that discomfort. We have to face it head on. The room remained quiet, the weight of her words sinking in. Finally, Karen Yates spoke, her tone hesitant but sincere. "You're right, Monica. We've been avoiding the hard conversations for too long. It's time we stopped." Monica nodded, a small but genuine smile breaking through her stern expression. "Good, because the hard conversations are just beginning. Blank. Underscore, blank." That evening, Monica attended a town hall meeting with employees from all levels of the company. The auditorium buzzed with tension as she stepped onto the stage. Faces turned toward her, some curious, some hostile, some hopeful. Monica took a deep breath, gripping the edges of the podium. "Thank you all for being here," she began, her voice carrying across the room. "I know the past few months have been challenging. Change always is, but I also know this. We can't move forward unless we're willing to look back. To see where we've fallen short, where we've failed to live up to our values, and to commit to doing better." A murmur rippled through the crowd, but Monica pressed on. "I've heard the concerns," she said. "Some of you feel like these new policies are unfair, like they create more problems than they solve. I hear you, but I need you to hear me. Fairness isn't about maintaining the status quo. It's about ensuring that every employee, every passenger is treated with dignity and respect." Her eyes scanned the room, locking onto individuals in the crowd. "This isn't just about policies. It's about people, about the moments we dismiss as small or insignificant, the glance that lingers too long, the tone that shifts when addressing someone who doesn't look like us, the assumption that someone doesn't belong. Those moments matter. They add up, and they define who we are as a company." The room fell silent, the weight of her words settling over the crowd like a heavy fog. Then, slowly, a hand rose from the back. It belonged to a young woman, her voice trembling as she spoke. "Miss Davis," she said, "I just wanted to say thank you for standing up for us, for making us feel seen." Monica's chest tightened, a flicker of emotion breaking through her practiced composure. "Thank you," she replied, her voice softer now. "But this isn't just my fight. It's ours, and together, we can build something better." Blank. Underscore, blank. As Monica left the auditorium that night, she felt a strange mix of exhaustion and hope. The road ahead was still long, and the resistance would only grow stronger. But for the first time, she felt the faint stirrings of change, the beginnings of a shift that could ripple far beyond Atlantic air. Walking into the cool night air, Monica allowed herself a moment of quiet reflection. The battle wasn't over, not by a long shot. But for the first time, she felt like the tide was turning. And for Monica Davis, that was enough to keep going.